Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for a story tonight, because boy have I got a lovely story for you, and I know you're going to thoroughly enjoy it. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I took the job. In truth, I had no choice, unless I wanted to be ambushed by the press all the time. These people were like a hungry school of sharks, hovering over a poor defenceless seal, ripping away at his flesh, and quite literally, I was that seal. I felt surrounded from every side, so much so, by this insufferable chaotic tangle of reporters that were not leaving me alone. They were doggedly determined like a dog with a bone, and would nonchalantly cross any boundary in order to get me to make some kind of a comment. In truth, I had become like a prisoner in my own home. One reporter from the Chicago Tribune, I believe it was, had practically camped outside my front door, and had been slamming the door so violently hard with his knuckles just to intimidate me. I was quite sure he might break it down if given the chance. "Mrs. Stewart! We think you owe us an explanation, don't you? If you give us an exclusive interview, I'll get these other reporters to leave you alone," came one loud male voice. "We'll pay you well for your time. I'm sure you're going to need the money, now that all your funds are frozen. Don't you want to at least clear your name? Your failure to talk to the press makes us increasingly suspicious that you know about your husband's treacherous dealings. If you have nothing to hide, Mrs. Stewart, you will speak to us." I was hearing all these kind of requests being launched at me from outside the front door, their poisonous, vile words like threatening darts being flung at the wood, and all these reporters hoping to hit the bull's eye, with me finally agreeing to have an exclusive interview with one of them. Many thought that I would meekly finally buckle over under the pressure and open the door for them, but that was not going to happen. I might be many things, but I was no pushover. I could weather many a storm, and was as stubborn as a mule when given the chance. And when I put my mind to something, there was no stopping me. I would not cave under any pressure, so they had met their match when it came to me. I refused to allow them to intimidate me, so I wouldn't just roll over like a deferential, submissive dog on my back, passively agreeing to their demands so that they'd finally leave me alone. There was no negotiation with iron-willed people like this, that crawled around you like angry ants on a sticky bun. In truth, if I had to live like a prisoner in my home for the next few days, even weeks, so be it. I would surely do it, until I was physically thrown out of my house, with the bank waving its foreclosure notices at me, like a flag above the house on Independence Day, which I hasten to say was a very real possibility, as my whole life had come crashing down like a large pile of dominoes, and I was watching it all spontaneously combust. A few weeks earlier, when I was sunning myself on the decks of a glorious Baltic cruise liner, with my husband drinking pina coladas and watching the sun setting over the horizon, we had visited all the Scandinavian countries, including Russia. I had not for a single moment envisaged that a few weeks from now my life would be lying around me in ruins, as if a volcano had erupted its treacherous molten lava over me, and perfidiously covered my life under its bubbling inferno, incinerating everything it touched. Life could be a bitch when she wanted to be, and I felt as if I had been individually singled out for her wrath, like a kid being bullied implacably on the school playground for being an oddball of sorts. I was not going to have my face slashed over the newspapers indiscriminately, if I could possibly help it. All my friends had distanced themselves from me, refusing to even talk to me, as if in some way I was responsible for my husband's insidious, sordid crimes and his duplicity. I had been left with nothing, no friends, no family, no money. My husband was no longer accountable for his crimes, for his body had been conveniently recovered in a large body of water, where witnesses saw him jumping from a high bridge to end his life, and had begged him not to do it, but he had failed to listen. As one bystander told the Evening Herald, The man seemed to be in a trance of some kind. We called out to him, told him not to do it, but he just wouldn't listen. He jumped off that great height, and I knew in that moment the man was a goner. I had no pity for Terry, not after what he'd done. My husband had always been a coward like that, running away at the very first sign of trouble. Whenever we had a disagreement during our marriage, he would do much the same. I mean, why change the perennial habits of a lifetime? He'd march out of the house saying, "I don't want to talk about this now, Jennifer. Not when you're like this. I really don't. You're being awfully unreasonable. I'll leave you to cool down for a while." Let's just say a while was probably a couple of days for my husband, sometimes even more. Where he went, I don't know. And I hope to God it wasn't a hotel room into the arms of a lover. But in hindsight, my husband really did have a secret life that I really knew nothing about. So I'm afraid if he did have lovers crawling out of the woodwork like termites, I'd know nothing about it. And if that was indeed the case, I no longer cared a damn. I just wish as a wife I'd been more perceptive. But honestly, nothing about my husband made me aware that beneath the benign, handsome facade was a man who was as cunning as a fox, who even made his own wife believe he was a man of great moral fibre, which means he was a master of deception. By the time he returned home, I was so glad to see him that the object of our argument had all but been forgotten. I had been married to Terry for over 15 years, but I realised I hadn't known him at all. My husband was a privately reserved person. I remember my mother asking me what I actually saw in him. "It's the quiet ones, my sweetheart, that you do have to watch. Something about him gives me the creeps. I'm sorry, dear, but I have to say it. I am your mother. I'm entitled to give you my opinion." How I wished my mother was here right now. For if indeed she was, she'd stop at nothing to squat all these reporters away with a large kitchen broom. But my mother was no longer around. She'd been an unfortunate victim of a very aggressive bladder cancer that took her away from me far too soon, while my father lived on the other end of the world in Tanzania, helping the local community with green projects so people could become independently self-sufficient. He'd married a woman from Tanzania, and let's just say he didn't look like he'd be returning to America any time soon. He seemed happily settled in his simplistic new lifestyle. He phoned me when he heard the news and told me to keep my pecker up. Things would soon settle down, but would they? I was not so sure about that. As far as friends went, mine had evaporated like the cat's milk, left out in the sun for far too long. My best friend Natalia had thrown down the phone on me and said, "I thought I knew you, Jennifer, but clearly I don't. All this time I thought you were a decent human being, but it seemed I was grossly mistaken about you. How could you do such a treacherously evil thing to all those old people who were putting their trust in your husband's so-called investment schemes? And all the time you were defrauding them so that you could live the life of Riley on other people's hard earnings. People like you disgust me," she said, spitting down the phone at me like a spirited cobra. "Listen to me, Natalia, will you? Listen to me. I had nothing to do with any of this," I had said. "Please listen to me. You must understand. I had no idea what Terry was doing. He was always very quiet about his business practices. Yes, we had money, and lots of it, but I thought he was a self-made success story. I had no idea he was stealing people's life savings and defrauding people with his investment schemes. I had no idea. You must believe me. You really must." My words were echoed back to me on my cell phone, as Natalia had disabled our connection. Did she not realize that I was just as much a victim as everyone else who had been defrauded by my husband? But just by my mere association to him, I was being sadly stigmatized, my reputation stained with the same unfortunate brush. It seemed everybody believed I was guilty, even my very best friend. If Natalia thought so badly of me, how was there any hope in anyone else believing in my innocence? All my life I had abhorred corruption of every kind. Now I was being unfairly tarnished with it, almost as if the dust of my husband's reputation had now settled on me, and I had become contaminated. Suddenly I felt very alone in the world. No one was on my side. Everybody believed I was involved in my husband's inexcusable dealings. I suppose I couldn't blame them for thinking the worst of me. If the boot were on the other foot, I'd probably think the same. I'd like to think if I had a friend who was caught up in a tangled web of deception, that I'd give her the benefit of the doubt and hear her out before assuming she was a guilty party, like her husband. Ostensibly, as I thought about my late husband and what he'd done, I felt physically sick to the stomach. Indeed, I was so crippled by waves of nausea that thrashed against my insides like the frantic waves of the ocean, which meant I was struggling to keep anything down. How could the man I thought I knew and loved defraud all those innocent people who were putting money aside to secure their retirement? That was something I could not fathom. The man I'd been married to was a monster. I suddenly had empathy for every other woman out there who, by association to their husband, were inadvertently considered as culpable for their partner's duplicitous crimes, because their only mistake was that they'd married a monster, just like myself, and fallen victim to his charms. For the record, take it from me, it is possible to live with someone for years and years and be blindly oblivious to the dark side of their personality. In my unfortunate case, my husband had clandestinely, very cleverly, hidden his artful, guileful side from me very persuasively, so I had never suspected a thing. My blood would freeze over as I watched some of these victims on the news, describing how my husband, with his smooth, silvery tongue, had persuaded them to part with all their money. The way they described my husband was not the man I knew, who would not say boo to a goose. I considered him to be bashfully shy. They were talking about a man I did not know, a man who could sell snow to an Eskimo and get a hardened skeptic to fall for his fake investment schemes and to part with all their money. Believe me, that takes Machiavellian persuasion, shrewd design, masterful, very slick cunning. And so, yes, you could say I had married a sly fox, the kind of adroit man who could connivingly go to the chicken coop and deceitfully pretend to impose no threat to the chickens, and one by one he'd rip their heads off and then return home lovingly to his wife with a huge bouquet of flowers in his hands and some tickets for their next cruise to the Caribbean, and his wife would be none the wiser, only rather impressed at her husband's great success. I had never even known that other side to my husband's character, and even though he was now dead, I hated him with a burning passion for what he'd done, and any of the love I thought I had for him dissolved as fast as an aspirin in a glass of water. I'd never believed that love could dissipate so fast, but believe me, it did. It was overtaken by my complete, utter and total revulsion. When the mortifying allegations about my husband were now front-page news, let's just say my life came crashing down around me. You'd think I'd lie on the couch, crying my eyes out, feeling bitterly sorry for myself. But the only people I was sorry for were the victims of my husband's despicable crimes. I could not imagine how vulnerable they must be feeling, having lost all their life savings. How do you ever get over something like that? You've busted your gut working hard all your life, putting money aside to enjoy when you retire. You want to better the quality of your retirement, so you make what you consider to be sound investments. It gives you a tranquilizing sense of security that we all desperately need and crave in our lives. It insulates us from some of the blows that might come our way. It gives us a cushioning to buttress us up on those grey, cloudy, rainy days. Think about it. You invest in something to guarantee a huge return in interest, only to learn that you've been robbed blind, with your eyes wide open. Not only do you lightly feel like a prize fool for having trusted such an investment scheme and been seduced and beguiled by a man who promised you a great financial return, you feel as if you've been kicked hard in the teeth. I was so numb, hollow like an Easter egg, walking around my home with the restlessness of a hamster on a wheel, or like a very bored, stressed-out animal in a zoo enclosure, feeling totally bemused and bewildered by what had happened. I was far too afraid to leave my home. I was terrified of the confrontational demands that would be thrown at me. I'm glad to say that after a few days, the tenacious reporters gave up on me a little, as I thought they would. They had not met stubborn until they encountered the woman who refused to leave her home. They were not going to get any kind of scoop out of me. I knew they thought I was guilty, and trying to convince them otherwise would never have done me any good. So what was the point of arguing my innocence anyway? I realized if my best friend Natalia thought I was guilty, and she had known me all my life, there was no way I could convince anyone else of my innocence. When the police interrogated me, even they were not fully satisfied that I was completely innocent. The chief inspector told me in no uncertain terms that if he was to find I was involved in my husband's despicable fraudulent dealings, I could be faced with a lengthy prison sentence, and the thought sent the hair at the back of my neck standing up on end. I contemplated the very real possibility that someone might set me up to pay for my husband's insidious crimes, and that could easily happen. By all accounts, lots of innocent people end up in prison, being the scapegoat or whipping boy, if you like, for somebody else's crimes. My bank accounts had been frozen, the money fully confiscated, and much of the money my husband had stolen from his victims appeared to have disappeared off the face of the earth and could not be traced. It was probably squirreled away in an offshore bank account somewhere. My husband's really sweet sister Belle had to handle my husband's funeral arrangements, as I wanted nothing to do with him any more, and wanted to wash my hands of that part of my life. In truth, I could have scrubbed and scrubbed until my hands bled, and yet I couldn't get the muddy muck of my husband's treachery off my hands, almost as if I'd been contaminated by it. Belle had been my quintessential hero of the day, not only dropping me off food shopping and everything that I could possibly need, but handling Terry's funeral arrangements with great discretion. She choked back tears in her pretty blue eyes and said to me, "Jennifer, I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say. What my brother has done is outrageously despicable. For the record, I don't believe you had anything to do with his heinous crime. Indeed, I know you're just another one of his unfortunate victims, like we all are. The whole family is. It's so devastating what has happened." "Well, then you and your family are the only people that believe in my innocence." She shook her blonde locks furiously. "The press are painting you in such a bad light. It's disgusting, Jennifer. Talk about personality assassination. They don't even know you. They're barking up the wrong tree. Don't forget, Jennifer, I knew Terry very well. I know what he was capable of. When I was a little girl, he was always making me confess to things I'd never done, so that he could avoid getting into trouble. Years later, I asked myself, why did I allow myself to take responsibility for the things that Terry did? But he could convince you to do absolutely anything, even though you may not know why you married him. My guess is, unbeknown to you, you were caught under his spell, the spell of his persuasion, and you never even saw it coming for a moment. I promise you, the moment he met you, Jennifer, he told me, 'She's the one.' And the next thing, the two of you were getting married." "Did you even love him, Jennifer?" she asked me curiously, her eyes narrowing in intense scrutiny, as if she couldn't believe it remotely possible that anyone could really have loved her brother. I'd never realized until this poignant moment that Belle had never had time for her brother, but had put on the pretense of being a devoted sister. "I don't know. I thought I did," I told her. "But then again, he was always so secretive. My mother told me it was the quiet ones you had to watch. I guess in truth I never really knew him. But you know what? I thought I did. And what I thought I knew made me believe that I did love him. Your mother was right, you know, about it being the quiet ones you have to watch. Having said that, the cap doesn't fit for every bottle. I've known quite a lot of reticent people in my life. My dad, for example, is one of them, which is where my brother gets it from, I imagine. He's reserved and a quiet person, with a heart the size of the Empire State Building. He is so outraged by Terry, what that man has done, but not altogether surprised. None of us actually are. You see, we all knew my brother well. He nurtured a dark side that we were aware of. I always knew growing up that my brother could not be trusted one little bit. He never took responsibility for anything in his entire life. That's why he killed himself before the police got to arrest him. I think as his sister, I should feel sad for his sorry plight. But look at the mess he left behind him. Truly, he's like a fox in a henhouse, leaving nothing behind but a feathery chaos. Terry had no moral compass whatsoever. It was all about him, all about the money, nothing less, nothing more. Look at your life, for example, Jennifer. Not to put too fine a point on it, it's lying around you in smithereens. As are all those poor people, deprived of their life savings. So what does Terry do to escape any form of confrontation? He retreats to the depths of a dark body of water to escape it all, so he doesn't have to face the consequences of his actions. It's so typical of him, she said in disgust. He always was a coward. My parents are a complete mess about this whole affair. They're absolutely mortified. My mother is hysterical that her son has done this to our family. That brother of mine has thrown our family name under the bus and trampled it beneath his feet, as if it means absolutely nothing. My father has started up a charitable donation to try and raise the funds to reimburse the people my brother robbed. He is beside himself with grief over what my brother has done. But he'll stop at nothing, my dad, to make those poor people be reimbursed of every single penny they've lost. I mean, I ask you, Jennifer, how do you mourn someone who's done all this? My parents insist we'll take care of everything for you, Jennifer, in terms of the funeral arrangements, given the press won't bloody leave you alone. My advice is you need to get the hell away from here. My father was suggesting you should do a vanishing act, disappear for good. He's willing to give you a large suitcase of cash to tide you over for the next few years, so you don't leave a paper trail behind you. That is so kind of him, but there is no way your dad is going to be dipping into his literal retirement funds in order to help me out. I couldn't possibly accept that. I'd rather he put his money to good use towards helping out all those people who've been shortchanged. That is what I'd prefer. But don't you see? You're also a victim, Jennifer. You have absolutely no money. The bank is going to seize this house from under your nose. Where on earth will you go? What will you do? Who will ever employ you with the record of your husband behind you? Belle glistened with tears she didn't want to shed. She wiped them away with the back of her sleeve and managed a watery smile. She shook her head indignantly. I'll be damned if that brother of mine from beyond the grave steals our joy. The pilfering has got to stop. Everyone is suffering the ramifications of this travesty. I shook my head. You're right there, Belle. I have no idea what I will do, where I will go. But don't you worry about me. I'll think of something. Belle looked at me with a pitiful mixture of admiration and sadness on her face. You know what, Jennifer? You're a real trooper. You've got big courage. You were way too good for my brother. Far too good. In your case, the princess really did marry the toad. Promise me if you need help or money, you will call my family in a heartbeat. We're here to help at any time. I love you, Jennifer. You're like a sister to me. I was moved by my sister-in-law's spontaneous gesture of affection. She grabbed me lovingly by the arms, holding me tight, tears trailing down her cheeks like raindrops. I'm so sorry, Jennifer. You didn't deserve any of this. She then composed herself and grimaced. She took in a deep breath. Oh, I've got to go out there now. Face the piranhas. Wish me luck, will you? She left the house, opening the door with a brave swing and waving up her arms in the air as reporters struck their obtrusive microphones into her face. Belle Stewart, came a reporter's voice. Chicago Tribune here. What do you have to say about what your brother Terry did? For a moment I could hear Belle's crystal-clear voice rising above the reporters, and their voices suddenly became very still when she spoke. If you want a statement, I'll bloody give you one, shall I? For your information, I'm very sorry what my brother Terry did. But you people need to leave my family and my brother's wife alone. My sister-in-law knew nothing about any of this. You need to get your butts out of our business. Me, my family and Jennifer are just as much victims of this fiasco as all the poor people that lost money to Terry's treacherous deeds. That woman in there, she said, pointing to my house, cannot go anywhere thanks to you guys. She has nothing left. Her friends have abandoned her. Everyone believes she's involved in this debacle. But take it from me, she's as innocent as a newly born lamb. We would kindly appreciate you leave us the hell alone." I admired my sister-in-law sticking up for me like that. But I knew the bunch of piranhas swimming outside my front door were gunning for my blood, and there was nothing anyone could say that could persuade them of my innocence. It certainly made me reflect back on our history books and all those poor women falsely accused of being witches in the Salem witch trials because someone owned a black cat or were making tinctures from plants that people thought were spells of some kind because someone had visited someone who accidentally died, and everyone deduced that the woman had cast a deadly spell on the victim. I knew my husband's sister was absolutely right. I was in a very bad place, with a future that looked pretty grim, and without money I was not going to get very far. Little did I know help was finding its way to me from an unusual source that at first I would regard with a degree of scepticism. After what my husband had done, I was beginning to lose my faith in human nature, wondering if behind every warm, kind face lay something infinitely more sinister that remained hidden in the shadows. For the man I'd married was nothing less than a monster. Why should I trust anybody else? I was reading the foreclosure notice on my home when a knock came at my front door. I expected it was another reporter. I went to the door and said, "Please, will you go away? I've asked you people to leave me alone. I told you I have got nothing to say." "Mrs. Stewart, I assure you, I am no reporter, nor am I a debt collector or investigator, anything like that for that matter. I think what I've got to say will be of great interest to you and help you dig yourself out of the mess you currently find yourself in. I believe I could be a great resource to you. I could help you. I would appreciate it if I could come in for a brief moment to have a chat with you." "Is this some kind of a trick?" I asked, very wary about who was on the other side of the door. I was beginning to become exhausted at being hounded all the time. I surreptitiously wondered if a reporter was trying to pull a fast one on me. In my experience, there were no lengths that a reporter would not go to in order to get a good scoop. But there was something about the man's voice that set him apart from all the reporters I'd previously been hearing from, that had trudged at my front door of late, with a robust, fierce determination that was abrasive, abrupt, and even hostile. But this man spoke very eloquently, with a kindness in his voice that immediately got my attention, for I was hungry for someone to show me kindness, and like a starving dog devoid of that kind of loving attention when it was thrown in my direction like crumbs under a table, I was eager to gobble it up. Slowly but surely, with a degree of apprehensive, wary trepidation, layered with both uncertainty, doubt, and suspicion, I tentatively opened the door, very cautiously, leaving the chain on the lock, and peering gingerly through the crack. And that was the first time I laid eyes on Owen Mackenzie. He stood in the doorway wearing a dark, very distinctive parka coat, made, I imagine, of pure wool, over his slender form. He looked to be in his early 50s, but he could have been older or younger. His face was very boyish, so it didn't give much away. He was well-spoken, with an English twang to his accent. He was a debonair-looking gentleman, with aristocratic, refined features that you so often see in those gilded portraits from the past that are hung above mantels or on the wooden-panelled walls of stately homes. He gave me a warm, lopsided smile as I cautiously opened the door to let him in, and the smile reached up to his hazel-brown eyes. I had not seen that for a long time. The most recent smiles I had seen were when people scuttled past me like helicopters without wings, looking at me with abject pity when the story of my husband first broke out. I didn't know what was worse, to be pitied or to be thought of as some form of lowlife with criminal affiliations. "Just so you know, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, I am not interested, and if you're trying to sell me something, I don't want it. I've travelled a very long way to find you, Mrs. Stewart, so all I ask you is for you to spare me a few moments of your precious time. I cannot say fairer than that. And for your information, I have nothing to sell you. Nor am I trying to impose some kind of religious orientation on your life. That would be very insensitive of me, at such a testing, trying time in your life. Then what are you here for? I asked, raising a quizzical brow, sounding rather abrupt, as the man unabashedly removed his parka and flung it off on the side of one of my wing-upholstered chairs. He gestured for me to sit down opposite him. I'm here, he told me, to offer you a job as it happens. For a moment I stared at him rather blankly, with a bewildered, confused look creeping up on my face that was soon bathed in a degree of scepticism, which the man immediately discerned, because he jumped in with the words, "This is a serious offer, Mrs. Stewart, which I believe will be mutually beneficial to the both of us." "Before you give me your spiel, would you like a cup of tea?" I asked him, wondering why I was being so hospitable to this perfect stranger. But something about him gave me the need to be polite and courteous. "That would be most kind, Mrs. Stewart. I like my tea strong with 2 sugars and a little milk." I was secretly glad that the man stayed in the living room. I shuffled to the kitchen rather awkwardly, where dirty dishes, plates and mugs were piled up so high around the sink, bearing a remarkable resemblance to the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I immediately circled around the kitchen, preparing tea, which I brought into the living room in a china periwinkle teacup and saucer, privately wondering if I'd made it far too strong. Somehow I felt this very distinguished-looking gentleman was used to the finer things in life, and I doubted he'd ever drunk tea out of a mug before. It turned out I was probably almost right. But if I had presented Owen Mackenzie with a mug, he'd have drunk it politely, because that was the kind of man he was. Even if Owen was sitting on a table where he was being offered sheep's eyes by his host as a delicacy, I doubt he would have refused it. He'd have popped them in his mouth and said, "Quite delicious," so as to please his hosts. Owen took a sip and looked appreciatively. "You make a good cup of tea, Mrs. Stewart. I like builder's tea, and a woman who makes a good cup of tea, well, it says a lot about her personality, in my opinion." "What is builder's tea?" I asked, scrunching my eyes up together quizzically. "I've never heard of that term before." "It's how many of the English like their tea, extra strong. You see, in the good old days, on the building sites in England on freezing cold winter days, the builders would drink their tea extra strong, sometimes even making it with 2 tea bags in a single mug. They were working outdoors, you see, in freezing cold conditions, sometimes unable to barely feel their fingers. They needed to drink something to build up their strength and give them lots and lots of energy. Hence the name builder's tea was born, and all over England, people much like myself thoroughly enjoy a very strong cup of builder's tea." "Well, that would make sense to me. If you're working out of doors, I suppose, you probably like things to be extra strong. Now, I don't mean to be rude, Mr. Mackenzie, but you didn't come here to discuss English builder's tea with me. What is this all about that you believe would be mutually beneficial for me?" Owen Mackenzie rubbed his smooth, perfect-shaved chin, that I doubted would ever be able to support a full beard. "As I told you, I'm here to offer you a job. It could not be more self-explanatory than that." "Go on," I said, raising a brow. "You've got my undivided attention. But if I don't like where this is going, I'll have to ask you to leave at once. As you can fully appreciate, I've been hounded by reporters day in and day out, and frankly, I'm exhausted." "I understand, Mrs. Stewart, but hear me out, will you? My name is Owen Mackenzie. I live with my mother on our country estate at Stanhope Hall. It's a large manor house that belonged at one point to Lord and Lady Stanhope, who bought the place in the 1920s after emigrating from Scotland. Long before that, in the 1800s, that part of the world was all but a rugged wilderness with nothing on it, beyond, of course, the indigenous wildlife and the occasional random little house or cabin, if you like. But it was wild territory, uninhabited, uncharted, probably more devoted to those involved in the pelt trade, stuff like that. I grew up at Stanhope Hall, which is situated on the Canadian border, near Lake Superior, Minnesota. Well, very near the Canadian border, so to speak. My mother, in between the time I spent at an English boarding school, raised me there with my father, her uncle and aunt. My mother's uncle helped my mother move to Stanhope Hall when she reached her early 20s, where she remained in a safe sanctuary there, and has been hiding there ever since from a very dangerous unhinged man called Theodore McClutchetson, who believes that my mother is entirely responsible for his sister's fortuitous accident that rendered her crippled for the rest of her life. Of course, my mother had absolutely nothing to do with her fortuitous accident, but try telling that to a man who is convinced that my mother is entirely responsible for his sister's disability. If you'll forgive me for saying this, Mr. Mackenzie, but I don't see how any of this has got anything to do with me. You will understand when I explain things a whole lot better. My mother was a prima ballerina at the Sadler's Wells Ballet in England as a young lady. She was to be the understudy for the lead dancer in Swan Lake, called Rosa MacFerris. One day Rosa MacFerris fell down the staircase at the ballet studio and was permanently crippled after the event. Rose claimed she'd been pushed down the staircase deliberately and was quick to blame my mother, thinking and believing my mother had pushed her down the stairs in order to acquire the lead part in Swan Lake for herself, which is far from what happened. I understand both girls were equally as talented, so in the end the producers of the ballet pulled the girls' names out of a hat. My mother drew the short straw. Naturally, she was devastated that she had to be the lead dancer's understudy, but accepted the role with grace. For the record, she'd never have pushed Rosa down the stairs. She doesn't believe that Rosa was ever pushed, but the girl planted the idea in her own head to explain the random fall. I think it was just a dreadful, dreadful accident, but it's so easy to play the blame game when you feel life has dealt you a bowl of lemons. Let's just say Rosa's brother Theodore was very protective over his sister, and put 2 and 2 together to make 109. He made it clear to his sister Rosa that he would avenge my mother for destroying her ballet career. When he found my mother, he would kill her, and my mother's uncle, who lived overseas in America at Stanhope Hall, did not perceive these to be idle threats, so he took them grievously seriously. Theodore was a notorious criminal, you see, involved in heavy-duty London crimes, but unfortunately he was guilefully deceptive, able to cover his tracks masterfully, and had affiliations with people in positions of great power and influence, so was never arrested, but has been considered a person of great interest in a couple of missing persons investigations. But nothing was ever done to accuse him of any of these crimes, because some people, they get away with everything. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. I told you it's a very exciting story. You're going to love it. So don't forget to join me tomorrow night for part 2. I can't wait to see you then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.